Welcome to Newcastle Family History Society podcasts. The Newcastle Family History Society, located on Awabakal land in Newcastle, New South Wales, Australia, provides support for those interested in family history. This is episode 3 of our series, In the Shadow of Mount Sugarloaf. Today, we embark on an historical journey, a vivid account of a traveller from the late 1800s as he journeyed on horseback from Wallsend to Teralba via Minmi, bringing to life the landscape, challenges and sights encountered over 140 years ago. Let's join Benita Parker from the West Wallsend District Heritage Group as she recounts this arduous yet fascinating journey through the heart of coal country in the 19th century.
Shh! Listen to the sound of the lyrebird. Superb lyrebirds breed in April to October each year throughout much of the southeastern coastal regions of Australia, including the Sugarloaf Range. The male secures a territory, attracting potential mates by singing and dancing on one of the several mounds within it, while throwing the tail forward over the body and shaking it in an impressive display. The male will mate with several females, but it's the female alone that builds the nest, incubates the eggs, and cares for the young. In this podcast, I make no pretense of creating this story. It's taken directly from an account written by a traveller who passed through the country between Wallsend, Teralba and Minmi in February 1876. And reported in the Miners' Advocate and Northumberland Recorder on Saturday the 12th of February 1876 and Wednesday the 16th of February 1876. I'm sure this traveller would have heard the call of the lyrebird as he rode through the forested hills and gullies in the shadow of Mount Sugarloaf. The account refers to Wallsend, Teralba and Minmi and begins thus. The names of these places are now very often heard and seen in public print, and there has lately been a large influx of people into this district, to whom both Minmi and Teralba are only names. A brief description of both will perhaps not be deemed uninteresting. In writing this description, we shall imagine that our readers will accompany us on horseback, as this is actually the only practicable way by which they can obtain a sight of these places, unless they choose to walk, a mode of transport which, however pleasant in some cases, is not so in this. Diggers and others who have travelled on goldfields in this colony and in Victoria have often remarked the depressing sameness of the general features and appearance of the country. The interminable line of quartz ranges, timbered with stringy bark and bastard gum trees, and the steep and sharply defined gullies and the tortuous creeks, go to make up thousands of square miles in Australia. Coal and gold, though presenting many diverse qualities, appear to resemble each other in the general appearance of the country in which they are to be found. Strangers coming to the northern coalfields and knowing that coal is only to be found in stratified rocks have invariably expected to find comparatively level and undulating country. To their surprise, however, they find an uninviting tract of country composed in the most part of sand, steep and sharply defined ranges, flats overgrown with tea tree shrubs, and the elevated portions almost impenetrable from the close growth of heavy timber. Minmi is one of the oldest mining townships and was first opened by the Messrs. J. and A. Brown in the 1860s. At that period, and for some time afterwards, Minmi was one of the most important places in the colliery group of the Newcastle district. However, the pit had to be abandoned owing to a variety of causes. The principal one was the flooding of the Minmi mine by the creek finding its way into the workings. It had previously been sold to a Melbourne company who felt very angry that their property, so soon after purchasing it, should have become worthless. This little episode in Victorian speculation had a very cooling effect on the investors. The stoppage of Minmi resulted in the exodus of several hundred miners to other places in the district, and their numerous cottages which the workmen had erected were left, on the whole, to go into ruin and decay. This place, at the time of its prosperity, contained several large brick hotels, besides 2 brick chapels and other substantial stores and dwellings. The existence of such an establishment, with the few persons who choose to reside here and work elsewhere, and the few whose occupation was bushwork, tended to keep the place from dying outright, until Messrs. Brown once more came to the rescue and resumed operations, which they did in 1873. Since the resumption of operations, the population has gradually increased. The old cottages have been taken possession of and repaired, and the whole place has gradually assumed an improved aspect. The place stands pretty high and is consequently healthy. The hills surrounding the area are high and rather heavily timbered. The distance from this place to Teralba is about 4 miles and has to be reached on horseback as a rule, owing to the wretched track and the height of the ranges above Minmi. The whole distance from Minmi is bounded by shrub and trees, and not until you are told that you have reached Teralba are you aware of having done so. People in the other colliery towns have pictured this place as an attractive piece of country where there are pretty and comfortable homesteads surrounded with good land suitable for gardening and farming purposes. We regret to state, however, that a visit to this place will at once dispel all these ideas. The land in and around Teralba is of the most unpromising kind, and that any person should have selected such a site for cultivation is a matter for surprise. The flats that stretch for a few miles in the direction of Lake Macquarie and the Sugarloaf Mountain are composed of sandy alluvium, strongly mixed with gravel and small boulders, so characteristic of the district. I'd now like to continue to read from part 2 in the Miners' Advocate and Northumberland Recorder on Wednesday the 16th of February 1876. He goes on to say, "Notwithstanding the drawbacks, however, there are several settlers scattered around whose homesteads are seen here and there between the openings of the trees and the scrub. Most of these places, however, bear marks of dilapidation, and we could not help thinking that the enthusiasm which had prompted them to settle there had pretty well evaporated, and that they had resolved to discontinue the contest with nature, a result on which we could heartily commend. As is usual in the Newcastle district, there has not been any attempts made to construct roads. True, there are a few bridges here and there erected over the creeks, but I noticed that in every case they were thrown across creeks which would be impassable without them, a fact which greatly detracts from the credit which a stranger would feel inclined to give to the powers who ordered and defrayed the cost of such. Near to the vineyard of Mr. Cherry, the main road from Wallsend crosses what may be designated the main creek. We now call it Cockle Creek, and although it's wide and bears the marks of heavy floods in wet weather, there's no bridge over it. True, it has a rocky bottom which prevents wagons from sticking in its bed, but seeing that the banks on either side are very steep and are composed of loose sand into which the wheels of vehicles sink deeply, it's a shame that a bridge has not been constructed before now. The position of this portion of the road is a striking illustration of how little the successive governments of the colony will do for Northumberland, so long as it is within the bounds of possibility for horse and bullock power to drag their loads through bogs and quagmires will the government leave the residents to their fate, and only when it's not possible to get across these creeks without exercising the power of Elijah in making iron to swim, a gift which appears to have died with the old man, will the parent of the state come to the rescue. Having said so much, I must not omit to state that the frame of a bridge is erected over this creek, but from what I see, it appears to have been in hand a long time. The span is considerable, and before it can be completed so far to allow horse traffic, I'm very much afraid that the waters of another winter will have rolled between its pillars. Before coming on to the Wallsend Road, I observed the appliances of a boring party, which had recently been in use. But whether they had found coal of such thickness and quality as would induce them to open a colliery or endeavour to float a company, we could not ascertain. The workmen were not at work when we passed, and as there were so few people living about, and these few not particularly interested in the matter, we could not ascertain whether they had struck coal or not. Since then, however, it has transpired that a splendid seam of coal has been struck, some 10 feet thick, which no doubt will have a surprising effect on the future fortunes of this locality. The principal reason why so many persons have selected land here has been the coal which was supposed to underlie the surface. This discovery will now add to the value of land in this place, and doubtless in a few years more collieries will be opened up and the quiet life of the present residents will then become a thing of the past. A good deal of the land here has had the fences destroyed by bushfires, which gives anything but a cheerful appearance to the country. As an exception to the general order of things, at Teralba we must not omit to mention the vineyard of Mr. Cherry, which we found groaning under a splendid crop of grapes. The surface of this vineyard appears to be nothing more than sand, and to any person who did not see the crop of fruit with which the vines were loaded, the probability of such a soil producing remunerative crops would appear small indeed. We did not see Mr. Cherry at the time, so we could not obtain particulars as to his mode of cultivation, but from inquiries made from some of his neighbours, we were informed that he had spent a great deal of labour in trenching and in other ways preparing the soil for future profit. Considerable quantities of bone dust had been used, and indeed the crop of fruit on the vines at the time of our visit furnished ample proof that a large amount of nutritive elements must have been added to the soil, so naturally deficient of productive qualities. One of the female members of the homestead informed us that the drought had been a good thing for them, as they procured a much larger yield of grapes than in wet seasons, the wet spoiling so much of the fruit after it had ripened. Being intent on visiting Mr. McPhee's sawmill some 4 miles ahead, we pushed on from this place in the direction of the Sugarloaf mountain, at the base of which this sawmill is situated. The country up to this point preserves the features before alluded to, only its ranges are neither so steep nor numerous as nearer Minmi and Wallsend. But for gardening and agricultural purposes, it's on a par with the rest of the country. We arrived at the sawmill late in the afternoon, owing to the horse being out of tune and not able to travel fast. We found the engine hard at work and Mr. McPhee and his men doing their best to transform some of the splendid logs with which this part of the country abounds into weatherboards and quartering for use in Wallsend and elsewhere. The proprietor of this mill has been located here for some 18 months, and from that time to the present has done a considerable trade in timber. The establishment is not a large one, but what is wanting in steam power has been partly counterbalanced by the ingenious way in which the steam power is utilised. The engine is a 10-horse locomotive portable, worked up to a pressure of 55 pounds, by which the bench saws are driven for ripping up the planks after they come from the vertical. In other establishments of the same kind, where a similar kind of engine has been used, the breaking down has been done by hand labour, it being deemed practically impossible to make these engines drive both the ripping saws and the vertical. Mr. McPhee, however, has done here what is generally done at other sawmills where large stationary engines are used. He has fixed a small engine to the frame of the vertical and connected the same to the boiler by a steam pipe. Of course, the smallness of the boiler prevents him from working both engines at the same time, but this drawback is remedied by the breaking down being done at dinner time and in the evenings when the bench saws are not wanted. By this simple contrivance, a much larger amount of timber is turned out in a given time than in many mills of greater steam power where equal arrangements have not been made. The timber of this place is of excellent quality, and a large quantity of it has been supplied to Wallsend, both to the 2 collieries and for private building purposes. Mr. McPhee informs us that, owing to his having got the Wallsend colliery to supply during the next 12 months, in addition to his other customers, he has more orders on hand than he can execute. The mill and homestead stand on a 200-acre allotment, which he purchased since he located here, and certainly the proprietor has shown an eye to business. Not far from the mill, huge blocks of coal project from the banks of the creek, indicate rich deposits of the same material underneath the whole of the property. There is a splendid waterhole on this property, about 50 yards from the mill, containing a large quantity of pure water of excellent quality. The hole is some 15 feet deep at the present time, although the whole of the population have been using it during the summer. Having partaken of the hospitality of Mrs. McPhee and taken a look around, we left for home, which we reached late in the evening, fatigued with the heat and dust of a most uncomfortable day. This is the conclusion of the traveller's account. This first-hand account of the lands in the shadow of Mount Sugarloaf allows the listener to step back into a time past and see the land in an entirely different light from what we might see today. This journey was made by horse on the eve of tumultuous changes which were to come to the area. How grateful we should be that these early travellers, generally men, took such an interest in the countryside they visited to record their observations and journeys for us. to be able to access through Trove the old newspapers of the day and read the stories in just the same way as the first readers of the newspaper is a privilege. Often I wish these correspondents had left more details, including their names, and even included more of their feelings and reflections about the places they visited. To illustrate my point, I've included 2 brief articles submitted by our correspondent that makes interesting and entertaining reading. The first is about a lightning strike taken from the Newcastle Chronicle on Tuesday, the 8th of March 1870, and reads thus. Effects of lightning. During one of the late thunderstorms that visited this district, a large mahogany tree in Mr. A. Johnson's paddock at Teralba was struck by lightning, the effects of which has caused it to wither and die. The lightning caught the most prominent and central branch of the tree, which was a continuation of the trunk, and followed it down in a serpentine course, avoiding limbs and other protrusions to the root. Its escape into the earth only noticeable by a hole caused by the force of descent. In its course down the tree, it took a strip of bark about a foot broad. I may here mention, for the information of your readers, that the mahogany, stringy bark and ironbark trees are particularly susceptible to lightning and therefore to be avoided when there is lightning. The second article was written on the 27th of January 1871. Has been hard to decipher because of the quality of the print, but reads as follows. Orchard spoiling. Some idle vagabonds have on 2 occasions last week entered Mr. Johnson's orchard at Teralba and have helped themselves to a large quantity of grapes and nectarines. Mr. Cherry's orchard has also been visited by these marauders, who have eased his vines of some of their burden. But I understand he is acquainted with who the parties are. They will therefore possibly figure in your police court, a circumstance I would very like to see, as there are few individuals about the locality of Teralba that idle the principal part of their time and make a practice of robbing the gardens every fruit season. In our next podcast, however, we will look at the life of another early settler who left his mark forever on this land, a man named Joseph Holmes. Later in podcast 5, we will look more closely at some of these dramatic changes which came to this land in the shadow of Mount Sugarloaf as the black coal was uncovered. For now, however, let us listen so that we may hear the sounds of the forest and the call of the lyrebird.
As we conclude today's journey, we've taken a step back in time with an account reminding us of the perseverance of those early settlers and miners who navigated this challenging land, setting the stage for the industrial transformations that were to come. We look forward to you joining us for future episodes in this series, In the Shadow of Mount Sugarloaf, on Newcastle Family History Society podcasts.